We're going to be talking about a really useful grammatical construction in this lecture, and that is conditional sentences. We'll be talking about how you can use them in your letter to really supercharge your grammatical range score, but also show how you can use them accurately as well. So, conditionals. If you're not sure what they are, there is a much more comprehensive lecture on this topic in my Task 2 course. Hopefully you've already had a look at that and how they can be used to boost grammatical range. But as a quick recap, we'll remind ourselves of what conditional sentences are, what the four main different forms of conditional sentences are, and then we'll learn how they can be used in formal and informal letters for a variety of purposes. Okay, so conditional sentences, what are they exactly? Well, conditional sentences are sentences which contain two clauses, and they help us to understand the link between cause and effect. And the cause part of the sentence is the dependent clause, and the result part of the sentence is the independent clause. So as you can see, they are a type of complex sentence, as we looked at in the first lecture of this section. But there are four main kinds of conditional sentences, and the first of those is a zero conditional. And a zero conditional is generally used to talk about a condition, a general condition, something that happens usually or always. So we often use them to talk about like laws of nature in physics, for example, but also feelings if they happen automatically and regularly, like if I stop working, I feel listless and moody. So you can see here we've got the subject, I, and the present simple stop in that first clause about the cause, and then in the second clause, in the independent clause, we have the subject and the present simple again. So this is the simplest form grammatically. Subject, present simple, subject, present simple. We follow this with the first conditional, and the first conditional is used to talk about a real possibility and something that's usually very likely or quite likely, or that there is a genuine possibility surrounding. For example, if you visit in the summer, it's quite a likely scenario, or at least very possible, we'll get to see all the best sights. So notice here we're using the subject and present simple again in the dependent clause, just like last time, if you visit. But here in the independent clause, in the result section, we're using the subject plus will or won't plus the infinitive. We will get. Okay, so that's the first conditional. The second conditional is up next, and we use the second conditional to talk about unlikely scenarios or hypothetical imaginary scenarios or potentially even impossible scenarios to discuss events in the present and future. Now, despite that time, we actually use the past in the dependent clause. So we use the subject plus past simple. If I were you. If I were you, that's the dependent clause, and in the result clause here, I wouldn't. So it's subject plus would or would not plus the infinitive. Okay, so first conditional, present simple, will, won't. Second conditional, past simple, would, wouldn't plus infinitive. Now, of course, this is an impossible situation, an impossible hypothetical scenario. If I were you, I'm not you, so we use the second conditional here. Also, notice that when we are in the second conditional and we're following on from a first person pronoun I, we use were. We don't use was. You might hear native speakers sometimes saying was, but the rule changes here, particularly in writing. Be careful, don't use was, use were. It's much better. Now, third conditional. Finally, the third conditional is used to talk about the past. Here we're discussing unreal possibilities or conditions in the past. They're unreal because the past has already happened and we can't change it. But if we had been able to change it, this is what would have happened. There's a third conditional right there for you. So here's an example. If you hadn't made that decision, you had. So if you hadn't made that decision, the project would have been ruined. So here we're trying to emphasize that the person made a really good decision. But if they hadn't made that decision, the project would have been ruined. Now you can see here this is the most complex grammatical form. Here we're using the subject plus the past perfect in the dependent clause, in the cause clause, and subject plus would or wouldn't plus have plus the past participle, that comes in the result clause, in the independent clause. So this one's quite tricky to master, but it can be very useful to show your wide grammatical range if you can use it accurately and at an appropriate time in your letter. And that's what we're going to be thinking about now. Conditionals in use. When is an appropriate time to use each of these conditionals? Well, what I'm going to do here is basically just put some examples down for you to stoke your creativity and perhaps give you a bit of inspiration for if similar opportunities come up in the exam. Let's start with formal letters and look at a resignation letter, so resigning from your job. If I am unhappy, my productivity declines. Here we have the 0 conditional. An information letter, so we're giving information. If you speak to the manager, he will show you what to do. Notice no contractions here because we're in a formal letter. So first conditional, simple, followed by will plus the infinitive. Job application letter, so applying for a job here. If you were to hire me, I would guarantee you my utmost commitment to the position. Now this, we're not saying it's impossible, but we use the second conditional here because this is standard form in applying for jobs. If you use the first conditional and say, if you will hire me, it sounds rude. It sounds far too presumptuous. It sounds arrogant. So what we do is we soften that sound by moving into the second conditional. This is quite useful to think of in general. If you're worried that you're being a bit too arrogant or a bit too sure of yourself, move from the first conditional into the second conditional. And this is appropriate, particularly when applying for a job. And you can see here the past simple, if you were, followed by the would and the infinitive, I would guarantee. A complaint letter. If the waiting staff had listened to my dietary requirements, I would not have had to go through this ordeal. So we're very angry because we've been made to experience some unpleasant situation due to an allergy, perhaps. And you can see here, if the waiting staff had listened, past perfect, had listened, followed by the subject plus would or would not in this case, plus have, plus the past participle had. Okay, so complex form, but very useful, very good for complaint letters in particular. And we have one more here. It's an apology letter, and we have, if I offended you, I am truly sorry. Okay, now notice here, we're not using any of the conditionals that we spoke about before. We've got the past simple, offended, followed by the present simple, I am. Okay, now this is an example of what's called a mixed conditional. We're not going to go into detail about mixed conditionals in this course, but I do recommend looking them up in your own time if you want to learn a bit more about these. They're certainly not necessary if you want to score a band 7, but they can be quite useful to look at if you're really aiming for the absolute top bands. Now let's move on and think about informal letter examples. Again, we'll be looking at a range of purposes here. Let's start with an explanation letter. If you press the red button, it opens a new screen. Okay, so maybe we're writing to an older family member who's not quite sure about technology. If you press the red button, it opens a new screen. Sounds like something you're more likely to say on the phone, but yeah, you can see that why we're using the 0 conditional here, present simple, something that is a general condition. Invitation letter. If you can make it on Monday, we'll have a 6-pack waiting for you. Okay, very informal language here. First of all, make it rather than attend. Make it generally means if you can attend this party, for example. And then we have a contraction, wheel, as well as the expression 6-pack, meaning we'll have some beers waiting for you. But more importantly, for our purposes, you can see present simple, if you can make it, and followed by the future form, we will have. An advice letter. If I were you, I'd go as soon as possible. Again, notice I were rather than I was. But this is a very typical expression when giving advice. If I were you, if I were you. You can see it's past there, I were, followed by the would, I would, contracted I'd, followed by the infinitive go. I'd go as soon as possible. Maybe we're talking about going traveling or something. A thank you letter. If you hadn't been there to help, I would never have finished it. So here, the third conditional, very useful in a thank you letter to talk about how things would have been different if that person hadn't helped. Third conditional. Again, subject, past perfect in the dependent clause. In the independent clause, in the result part, we want would plus have plus past participle, or would not plus have plus past participle. Okay, you can also add a never in there to emphasize. And again, one more, have a look at another mixed conditional in the form of a complaint letter here. If you had listened to me the first time, we wouldn't be in this mess now. So you've got the first half looks like a third conditional. If you had listened to me, you've got that past perfect, but we follow it with something that looks like the second conditional, would or wouldn't plus the infinitive. And this is the idea of mixing something that happened in the past with a result that has an impact on the present. Okay, again, have a look into mixed conditionals in your own time if you would like. There are quite a few different kinds. That's part of the reason we're not going to look at it in this lecture, but certainly do take the time to have a look at those if you would like. We're going to finish up by thinking about some common errors with this particular grammatical skill. So because conditionals are quite tricky to master, they are often the source of a few errors in candidates' writing. But they tend to revolve around pretty typical similar errors each time. So we're going to put some of them down on the screen here, and I want you to see if you can find the common errors. If I can liaise with him this week, he would call you with the details. You will never have even taken this course if it wasn't for me. If the manager treated you this unfairly, you will not be a satisfied employee. If I was you, I wouldn't send that letter just yet. Okay, so maybe pause the video here. There's not many exercises here, but just take a moment to think about what the errors might be in each of these sentences, and I will warn you that in one of these sentences there are actually 2 errors. Okay, if you're ready, let's have a look. The first one, if I can liaise with him, he would call you with the details, should be he will call you. You can see that present simple being used at the beginning. If I can liaise, not if I could liaise, but if I can liaise, then follow with the subject plus will plus the infinitive. Okay, now the second one. You will never have even took this course if I hadn't shared it with you. You can think about what conditional we're trying to attempt here. Hopefully you see it as the third conditional. Because of that, you can see the corrections here. You would never, not will never, but it's would plus have plus the past participle. Yes, we've added a few extra elements in here. We've added a never, we've added an even, but the same form applies. You would never have even taken. You wouldn't have taken this course if I hadn't shared it with you. The dependent clause is actually perfectly accurate here, if I hadn't shared it with you. Now notice as well, something really important to take into account here is that we've swapped the conditional around. We've changed the order, and this is absolutely fine. It's a bit similar to the point that I made in the complex sentence lecture, that the point that you want to emphasize most should probably come at the end of the sentence, but the same applies here. You can swap the sentence around with the clauses, but notice that when we do so, we drop the comma. There is no comma in this sentence to connect the 2 clauses. We can remove that. We should remove that. If you add a comma, it will be incorrect. So no comma here. Okay, third sentence. If the manager treated you this unfairly, you will not be a satisfied employee. The comma returns. The sentence is in the normal order. What's wrong with it though? It should be you would not, because we have the past simple at the beginning. If the manager treated you this unfairly, you would not be a satisfied employee. Second conditional, past simple followed by would or would not plus the infinitive. Finally, if I was you, I wouldn't send that letter just yet. Now we've looked at 2 examples already of why this might be an incorrect sentence, so hopefully you were able to work this one out. The issue is the was. It should be a were. The actual form of the sentence is fine. We've got that past simple followed by would or wouldn't plus the infinitive to create a second conditional. But the appropriate word to use in this case is were, not was. And that's a subject-verb agreement error. So if I were you, I wouldn't send that letter just yet. Now, for a bonus point, see if you can work out what type of letter is involved in each of these sentences. Are we looking at formal or informal? And for another bonus point on top of that, think about the purpose of each letter as well. If the sentences are well written enough, you should be able to work out both of these things. Well, here are my ideas. So I think the first one is surely a formal letter. We're avoiding contractions and we're probably giving information here. So maybe the person has asked you for details, but you don't know the details. You have to get in touch with somebody else, but they're still asking you to give information. You're trying to give information. In the second one, it's an informal letter, but we're not happy. And I've used the expression complaint here, but complaint seems more appropriate for a formal letter when we're angry with an establishment. Maybe the better word here would be grievance. We have a grievance with somebody else. We're annoyed with them. We're upset with them for some reason, and we're writing this letter to express that. The third one, we have another formal letter. We're in a business setting and where there are no contractions. And so I think here we've maybe giving a letter about some sort of training, giving information again here, but a specific kind training, maybe training for employees or managers. And the last one, another informal letter, and we're giving advice. I haven't got any semi-formal examples down here because any of these sentences may be appropriate in a semi-formal sentence, really, if you just tweak it a little bit. Again, like the examples throughout this course, we usually focus on formal and informal because the semi-formal just falls somewhere in between, and so it's usually a case of just tweaking one of the examples from the formal or informal side depending on the level of semi-formality. So hopefully that gives you a decent idea of, first of all, what conditional sentences are used for, but also how they can be used in various ways in formal and informal letters in a variety of settings to boost your grammatical range and accuracy and really maximize your grammatical score. And now we're going to move away from range and think more about accuracy in particular as we finish up this section by looking at some common grammatical errors.